With gender-based violence a major issue in the country, the High Court in Grahamstown has overturned a men's rape conviction and 7-year sentence on appeal. The man argued that his then-girlfriend had consented to foreplay and he took that as consent to penetration. The victim said there was no consent because she was still a virgin and not ready for sex. So where do we draw the line when it comes to consent? Let's speak to gender activist and researcher Lisa Vetten. Lisa, thank you so much for making time. Before we get to the judgment and its implications, let's just help our viewers understand what the case was about, and then we'll get to the judgment and the implications.
Sure. Well, what the case dealt with was a relationship between two university students. She had said to him she wasn't yet ready to have sex, which he said he respected. And up until the evening concerned, they'd been touching each other, cuddling, generally getting to know each other, but there had not been penetrative sex. He invited her to come over to watch videos and to do some cuddling, which she agreed to. And that was what they did. And he then started kissing her. He then removed her pajamas. She said to him, please, I don't want to have penetrative sex. He then went on to have oral sex with her and then went on to penetrate her. He claims that he thought she was consenting. She says she wasn't. And it's quite clear she had told him at least twice she did not want to have penetrative sex with him.
So the acting judge, Tembeka Ngukaitobi, has ruled in favor of this appeal by Loyiso Xoko, who argued, as you say, that for the foreplay he had with this ex-girlfriend indicated she tacitly consented to sex. And what the judge wrote is that while the complainant told Xoko she did not want to have sex with him, what happened next was that there was no indication expressly or otherwise of any lack of consent of being undressed. After she was undressed, they continued kissing. Then she took off his clothes. No force or threat were used to coerce the complainant, said Judge Ngukaitobi. So in essence, the judge ruled that on the complainant's version, there was no manifestation of any refusal of consent between the kissing, the oral sex, and the penetration. So I imagine the issue here is about consent and how it's expressed, because the judge said that it could not be said that the gentleman knew explicitly that there was no consent.
The problem here is a legal one. One is the idea that in law you need to have an intention to commit a crime. So he thought she was consenting, but he didn't intend to rape her. We have a problem with law. The second problem we have is that we live in a society that routinely encourages men to ignore when women say, I don't want to have sex. So she had told him twice, I don't want to have penetrative sex with you. He didn't listen to that. He pushed on and then claimed that she was giving him mixed signals and that he should continue. There's no recognition of the fact that he ignored what she had told him, now put her in a position where she was confused as to know what to do, which is what she says. She's also not somebody who is sexually experienced and would necessarily know what to do when somebody is behaving in this way. And I think the other difficulty is that women are simply not socialized when men ignore their no, to punch them hard in the face and then to tell them, if you continue with this, I'm going to hit you so hard that you won't know what your name is. That is not how women are socialized. They are socialized into being acquiescent and compliant. And it becomes even more difficult when you don't know what to do. So I think there is a real problem here in that the law is undergirding and reinforcing men's perspective that even if women say no, they can continue to push on and then claim, oh, well, she was giving me mixed signals. Whereas actually it was you who were confusing her and you need to take responsibility for that.
And I've seen some people ask whether or not this raises questions about whether foreplay that includes extensive French kissing, undressing, and engaging in oral sex actually constitutes tacit consent for penetrative sex. But we can never work on assumptions, right? The best way is simply to just ask. And what we need to know is that consent can be withdrawn at any time.
Exactly. And I think there's a real confusion here. There's an understanding in the law and in the judge here that the only act that is sexual is vaginal penetration. Whereas anything else that happens before that is foreplay, and therefore if you agree to it, it means that you've agreed to everything else that somebody does. No, not at all. And in fact, even our law understands that there is our law, even actually in relation to rape, actually recognizes that oral sex is sex, and if you don't obtain consent for that, that too is rape. So our law is quite clear that these are two different acts, and that oral sex is not necessarily foreplay. So, there needs to be understanding that there are different acts here. You need to obtain consent before all of them, and you don't just persist because on the assumption that, oh, well, if you've allowed me to kiss you, that means I can continue, or, oh, you've allowed me to hold your hand, that means you basically signed a contract to allow me to have penetrative sex with you. No, not at all. And I think that's why we need a society that needs to encourage men to think about, not just make assumptions, or just push ahead and think that one thing equals the full menu.
Yeah, and someone can say, yes, let's go for penetrative sex. And 5 seconds later, they can decide, I withdraw that consent, and they're within their rights to do so. What lessons can we take from this? How do we avoid a similar situation where after sex, there are lingering questions about whether or not two adults consented?
I think there are a couple of things. I mean, one, we've got to go back to obviously some real basics around what is consent and how you ensure that it has been obtained. Second, I think it's something that men need to be reminded again and again. If somebody has told you no, don't push on and think that you can try to eventually overwhelm them, coerce them, into eventually pressurizing them to say yes so that you can continue with a clear conscience thinking that what you're doing is not rape. It isn't. You've overridden and pressurized somebody in a variety of different ways to having sex with you. That's number one. Number two, we need to go and look at the law very carefully around questions of intention. Number three, I think it's very clear that we need to engage in more training at the level of both prosecution, magistrate and judiciary around thinking through these complex questions of consent, especially when it occurs in relationships, because this is where I think we tend to have the most problems with rape, is that it's very clear when it's a stranger and there's a weapon that somebody hasn't consented. But we have yet to properly understand what meaningful, genuine consent is in a relationship where people know each other.